Welcome to our special report on this week's Australia-China Leaders Forum. I'm Helen Daly at the Sky News Centre and I'm joined by my co-anchor, James Chow from CGTN, China Global Television Network. Great to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Excited to be back.
Very good. That's great to have you on with us. Now, as you know, James, Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull and Premier Li Keqiang they've really spent the day in bilateral talks, but of course, one of the really important issues we're going to look at in a moment. But James, what were the key issues the key moments that came out for you?
Helen, I think if you look at it broadly, the three big moments would be two great leaders from two great countries coming together here in Canberra and Sydney. I think the second thing is they've accelerated that free trade agreement, which is going to make a difference to everyone's pockets. I think lastly, they've made a commitment to the big politics. They're looking at the big vision. They're staying away from isolationism. They're staying away from protectionism. And they're saying that they're part of the world and they want to drive that world.
And that we will get into a lot more in detail with our guests. But of course, the pair have signed a new trade deal, which will allow Australian beef producers to export chilled beef to China. The deal will see an expansion from 11 exporters to all eligible Australian exporters, with the Prime Minister saying it will drive future growth for agricultural exports.
Australia is the only country in the world with this market access. Australian chilled beef exports to China are already worth $400 billion a year. And more companies will also be eligible to export frozen beef. Total beef exports overall are worth around $1 billion a year. This new agreement will drive significant future growth. To welcome investment from China, with the stock of foreign direct investment growing to $35 billion by the end of 2015. And Australia's stock of direct investment in China has grown from $847 million in 2005 to $14 billion in 2015.
The bilateral talks, of course, also centred around the South China Sea, which we'll also talk about in a moment, James. But with Premier Li moving to play down his country's so-called in the region. Now, the Premier said it was the responsibility of all countries in the Asia-Pacific to maintain peace and stability in the South China Sea.
China never has any intention to engage in militarization in the South China Sea. China's facilities on Chinese islands and reefs are primarily for civilian purposes, and even if there is a certain amount of defense equipment or facilities, it is for maintaining the freedom of navigation and overflight in the South China Sea, because without such freedom or without stability in the South China Sea, the Chinese side would be among the first to bear the brunt of it.
Well, I'd now like to introduce the rest of our panel to join James and I, and of course we're joined by Tim Harcourt, economist with the University of New South Wales. Great to see you, Tim.
G'day, ni hao.
Ni hao to you too. Now, Peter Jennings is also the Executive Director from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, who's in our Canberra studio. Peter, welcome to you.
Thanks very much. Hello, Helen, and everyone else.
And of course, James Daggar-Nickson, Sky News business editor, is also with us. Welcome to you, James.
Thanks, Helen. Thanks, James.
Now, I want to start with Tim Harcourt, really. Should we see, if we talk about a broad overview, should we see special significance in the timing of this visit by the Premier, given that we have the President of China going to a summit with President Trump next month?
Well, I think the timing and the substance matter. Trade deal, we'll be having a mining boom, a dining boom, an education boom, a services boom as a result of this deal today. And secondly, I think it's a signal that as President Trump puts protectionism back on the table, China is going to basically take a leadership role in favour of globalisation and in favour of open markets, something we may not have expected 10 or 20 years ago.
Yeah, I think I was going to agree with Tim. I think it is significant. I think, so from memory, what, 11 years, I think, said Premier from China visit these shores. I think, you know, the relationship between the two is so important. I thought that was really borne out, and James sort of touched on it. I think the significance of the visit by Premier Li and the fact that it really encapsulates the importance of the relationship between the two, but also coming at a time, as Tim mentions, when the world is starting to see a little bit of a paradigm shift, particularly from the US when it comes to perhaps backing away from global trade. That seemed to be one of the strong commitments coming out from both leaders over the past couple of days, not just a commitment to trade between each other, but also using that as an example to very much promote global trade, and I think that's very important.
Yeah. Peter Jennings, how do you see the timing of this from your perspective, more sort of strategic, diplomatic, defence, that sort of thing, given that we are going to see this major summit between the leader of China and the leader of the US just next month? Is this meant to be a precursor to that?
To be honest, Helen, I think it's probably more coincidental that it's happening before the visit of the Premier and the President. You know, my own sense is perhaps not as optimistic as the other speakers. I think we're in some deeply troubling strategic times in the region. We've got a full-on crisis emerging on the Korean Peninsula, and I think we've got some serious problems as well in the South China Sea. I think Premier Li's dismissal of concerns about China's militarisation of the islands is frankly risible. And frankly, the problem we have to worry about now is the extent to which these strategic concerns might actually start to cut away at the very positive trade and economic relationship which we've had with China for so many years.
Yeah, I do want to, obviously, we're going to get to the strategic issues, Peter, and it's very interesting that you raise them and talk about the seriousness of them. But perhaps let's talk about the, not necessarily the positive parts first, but James, I just would like your view on that idea of the timing of this visit to Australia. Is it meant to perhaps soften up the Americans for what they're discussing here, which is much more trade liberalisation? Don't go down the protectionist route.
Well, I think that if you look at it, maybe what Peter said is that you can't always control the timing, but what you can control is the opportunity to shape the narrative before the two leaders in Washington and Beijing meet together over, well, we're told is over in Mar-a-Lago in Florida, but who knows. But it's certainly an opportunity to do that. And before they go over there, for the Australian and Chinese leadership to consolidate the position of the Asia-Pacific. You've got a bipolar world. It's not quite a multipolar world. You've got a bipolar world, and one of them is living right in your regional backyard. They're going to come together, they're going to build their position, and then he's going to take that whole package, the president, Xi Jinping, when he goes over to Florida, so we're told anyway. So coincidental timing perhaps, but I think by design and the opportunity, it's all there.
Yeah. Let's talk about trade. Tim Harcourt, you've for years, as has James Daggar-Nickson on the Business Channel. I mean, these are absolutely crucial. China is a crucial relationship for Australia. But I think Premier Li was saying today, very much it's a two-way street. Now, this two-way trade, they do want to improve. They see it increasing even more. Do you agree with that? Is that too rosy a picture?
No, I think it actually picks up James's point just now that China is not a vacuum in this. China's competing with Korea, Japan, other nations for energy security, for food security, for access to high-value professional services. So it's quite important for China to lock in these very important deals before someone else nabs it from them, regardless of what President Trump does.
And when you look at the numbers alone, Helen, 1.4 billion people living in China, you can call China really the continental demand. And you can look at Australia and say this is a continental supplier, a country which is still about 11 hours away from Beijing, but a country that has so much to offer, both in terms of the natural resources, both in terms of the food, the good quality ingredients, whether it be the milk powder and so forth, the seafood and all that. But when you take it as a whole picture, Australia and China have the opportunity because they don't have borders with each other. They don't have territorial claims on each other, and that is the
that makes it easier.
It makes it a lot easier,
Yeah.
and I think when we look at the South China Sea issue, that could create a problem that actually isn't there.
All right, I don't want to get onto that yet. James Daggar-Nickson, this trade relationship is crucial. Now, today, Premier Li talked very much more about the services trade and investment increasing. He wants it to increase. Particularly, you know, there's a huge attraction of students and tourists to come to this country. Where do you see services going?
Well, the numbers are staggering. Two-way trade, which people talk about, I think last year was about $150 billion, and 260,000 Chinese actively studying in Australia at the moment. Last year, 1.2 million visitors, tourists came here to Australia. Huge, and a lot of that is in services. To James, I think we need to move beyond, from Australia's perspective, digging things out of the ground and selling it to China and to various economies. There is far more sort of service-orientated professions that we can put it, be it financial services, be it tourism, be it education. That's where the longer-term opportunity is going to be for Australia, sending a lot of that expertise and that knowledge offshore. And China, of course, is a huge market. It's not just China. China's very important in that, and they're going to maintain, I suppose, a crucial ranking member in terms of what we have to offer. But services is where Australia's future is going to be over the long term. And I think hearing both leaders talk about that is very encouraging. Yeah,
James, let me just throw in a bit of a devil's advocate position. There are still risks and challenges with trade, and the business community sees it. They see regulatory uncertainty, and we saw that with the e-commerce cross-border changes that were put on some of our companies last year. This week, there's a permanent stay on bringing in those changes, so share prices of Bellamy's and Blackmore's kind of shot, well, Blackmore's certainly shot up again. There's also, you know, occasionally Australian executives find themselves thrown in jail in China.
That's right. Of course, I think there's about still 14 Crown employees detained in China. Just firstly to, I suppose, the regulatory uncertainty is a clear concern for many business people in Australia. And while many people are looking at the positives of this week's announcement in terms of the indefinite suspension of those increased regulations on cross-border e-commerce, just the fact that that can come unannounced itself is something you can't really prepare for or invest in when you know that the regulatory landscape can shift so quickly. What is encouraging, I would say, though, is a lot of the commentary coming from Premier Li, and certainly the encouragement coming from Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull is about, I suppose, getting more transparency, getting tighter regulation, but also a greater understanding of regulation within China's economy, because there's no doubt from someone on the outside looking in from a business perspective, it is a great concern. And then, of course, you have some of the other issues around running foul, if you like, of various measures to crack down on, in this case, corruption, gambling and advertising for that gambling.
Bringing finances out of the country. There's also been a crackdown on that.
I should say, though, that it wasn't an unknown issue within China, the idea of spruiking for gambling as well.
That's exactly right. That was known.
But I mean, when you look at the surveys, I mean, more small businesses have lost money in the United States than in China through litigation or through, you know, crook deals and so on. And there's around 10,000 small businesses now exporting to China, you know, including Hong Kong, compared to 6,000 for the United States. So in many cases, I don't think it's just big rocks and crops and BHP. It's actually right at different levels of the economy now.
And so many more people are not as visible. The Prime Minister was doing the rounds of different meetings over at the Western Hotel. And you have the same message, Malcolm Turnbull saying that e-commerce is the way forward, talking about Alibaba. He went and met Jack Ma over in Hangzhou during the G20, talking about JD.com. You know, cashless, fast ways, full of choice of high-quality products. I think that's also part of that same picture, even though it isn't a uniform one.
All right, we are going to take a very short break. Peter Jennings, we haven't forgotten you. We're going to come back and talk about possible trade war, security, and China's so-called build-up in the South China Sea. So stay with us. We're going to have a short break, but we'll have to the Australia-China Leaders Forum. Welcome back to our special report on the Australia-China Leaders Forum. I'm Helen Daly. I'm joined by James Chow from CGTN TV network. Now, I'm going to reintroduce my guest, Peter Jennings from the Australian Strategic Institute is with us, Tim Harcourt, economist from the University of New South Wales, James Daggar-Nickson, Sky News business editor. So let's get into it. We were talking before the break about trade, but I do want to ask you, Peter Jennings, do you think there will be a trade with States and China? We've certainly heard Donald Trump virtually threaten that during the election campaign.
I think there are some serious risks at the moment in terms of the China-US relationship. Trump is extremely unpredictable. You have a number of people in the administration, like Jim Mattis in Defence and Tillerson, the Secretary of State, that look like they're trying to sort of normalise American policy. And then you have the insurgents in the White House, like Steve Bannon, who look as though they're doing their very best to sort of break the continuity of American government. And how that will play into the management of the relationship with China, I think, is extremely unpredictable.
Oh.
And one thing I will say is that it's got the Chinese quite worried. In some respects, it's actually making them be a bit more restrained in terms of the policies they're pursuing in the South China Sea.
Yeah, well, that's
but
an interesting...
in the medium term...
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Tim Harcourt, do you think those threats by Donald Trump will actually eventuate into anything?
I think what we're seeing is trade policy by tweet. And what he's trying to do is to basically use the bully pulpit to get American companies to keep a few jobs in Michigan and a few jobs in Wisconsin. And for the most part, he'll try and do as much as he can. The unemployment rate is falling in America. Thanks to Janet Yellen, he can take credit for that. And we may not even get to the stage where he has to whack tariffs up on China. And if he did, of course, trade policy is actually made in Congress, not in the White House.
Yeah, I think it played well during the campaign, you know, painting out certain economies and countries as negative lights.
Carried a few extra states.
Exactly. Played to that populist rhetoric that we've seen him really take up the mantle of. I think, and I agree with Peter, it's unknown. Anybody who suggests they know exactly what Donald Trump's going to do, I would take with a grain of salt. However, there must be a recognition of the... I suppose the loss on both sides, should they go down any kind of a trade war, it would be bad for China, which would be bad for the region, and it would be very negative for the US. And I think
it would be very negative, wouldn't it, for
tariffs,
American consumers?
That's right.
And the American worker.
Tariffs,
and the worker.
Yeah, Apple iPhones and all the products that are made offshore in China and so forth that are imported, well, the American consumer is the one that's going to pay in the end.
All right. James, let me ask you, do you think the reiteration, I guess, by Premier Li and Prime Minister Turnbull about we mustn't let protectionism come to the fore, trade liberalisation, we must stick to those guns, is in a way to partly try and persuade America, to convince America not to go down the protectionist path?
Absolutely, and I think it's not only the United States. You see a number of countries right now with very strong leaders who are leading on a very nationalist front as well. I mean, we don't need to name them over here. We all know which ones they are. But I think obviously it's a positive encouragement, but also not do their worst, but also showing that this works. I mean, as James said just then, you know, if the United States enters into a trade war with China, the first one to lose will be the United States, will be its electorate. So I think that, you know, we do need to take that with a slight pinch of salt and instead look at the bigger picture. Here you have two great influences in the Asia-Pacific region. And I do want to say here very quickly at this point, because this has been one of the debates throughout the last 2 days here. Should Australia choose China or should Australia choose the United States? I think Australia should choose Australia. It should do exactly what's best for itself. It should put its own interests first and foremost. Nobody expects it to be a playground mentality where they then had to start choosing friends. If you can't be one with the other, you cannd be friends with the other.
That is interesting. Peter Jennings, how do you see this? Because, in fact, one of the first questions one of the Chinese journalists asked our Prime Minister today was about, you know, should you now prioritise Australia? Should you, Australia, now prioritise your relationship with China over the United States? There seemed to be that China is pushing us to choose.
I think that China is. I think China's made it very clear at all levels of government for a very long time that they don't like our alliance relationship with the United States. They refer to it as Cold War mentality, and they would rather we weren't an ally. My sense is that, you know, Australia does need to have a tough-minded assessment of its own strategic interests here, and that means it needs to be prepared to push back against China, where, for example, we have this kind of language about you should now distance yourselves from the US. That's just not going to happen. And clearly, you know, the more we have a sense of what our strategic interests are and a willingness to put that both to Washington and Beijing, I think the better we'll be.
James?
I think we shouldn't overplay it too much. I think that was a question from a reporter, and I don't think it was very sophisticatedly framed as well. That's not an official. That's someone, you know, in the journalism field who should be asking those questions as well.
Would you agree, though, that both those superpowers want us to choose?
But China needs us, doesn't it?
I don't think so.
You don't think so,
I
Tim?
don't think so.
China needs us. China needs energy, food security, all these things.
They both want us and need us.
Well, they both need us, so China will say a few things, but at the end of the day, China's got Korea, Japan, India, other countries that want to be also very important, trading partners. So of course they're going to need us.
It's
and of course they'll say a few things, but
it's nice to feel wanted, isn't it?
If you look at it from a strategic perspective as well, I mean, to Peter's point, I mean, there is that long relationship with the US, and you had those comments from the Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, which we saw Beijing not exactly embrace, and the idea of wanting to see the US take a greater stance and leadership role in the Asia-Pacific. There's no way China, Beijing, wants to see a greater influence of the US in the Asia-Pacific. At the same time, they're trying to exert their influence in Australia at the moment because of their relationship between both powers. It's a difficult position, but it's a crucial one.
All right, I do want to ask you in a moment, but James and Tim, how do you see what Peter Jennings said at the outset of the program, that China's perceived military build-up in the South China Sea is seen as a concern, certainly to defence strategists like Peter? James, do you have a view on that, James Daggar-Nickson?
Sorry? About
this, the build-up of China's on the islands in the South China Sea. I mean, is that something that Australia should be worried about? It is in their region. It is in the Western Pacific.
I think Australia, as a leading voice within the region, has a duty to speak up about anything that has been judged in an international court to actually be against the law. I think it is a natural position that Australia should take. They should do it in diplomatic ways, and certainly that's the road that Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull has taken. But yes, I do believe they should speak up.
I think James put it very eloquently. We don't choose China or America, we choose Australia. And that means that when it comes to China joining the WTO or setting up the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, we support China. When it comes to matters of international law, we are a proper multilateral middle power, and that makes sense. It goes to Peter's point.
Peter Jennings, so just very quickly, we've only got a couple of seconds left really, but do you think it is something that, why shouldn't China kind of flex its muscle in a sense? I think that was a term Paul Keating has used in recent years, in that area of their sort of region, the Western Pacific. Why should they not flex their muscles a bit?
Because it's also an area critical to too many other countries, and China may well want to protect its trade going through the South China Sea, but so does Japan, and I can assure you Tokyo is not going to subcontract its security to the People's Liberation Army of China. This is where some compromise is ultimately necessary, or else we're going to find ourselves in a very serious military crisis.
Well, I'm a guest here in Australia, so I think I'll finish off with some of the words from a great Australian leader. You mentioned him, Paul Keating. He said just a couple of days ago, the rise of China is entirely legitimate, cannot be delegitimised to suit US strategic planners.
All right, we do have to finish our program there. I want to thank you all. That is it for our special report. Thanks to my guests, Peter Jennings, Tim Harcourt, James Daggar-Nickson, and of course to my co-host, James Chow. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for watching. See you next time.